On the morning of April 19th, 1995, no one in Oklahoma City could have expected that their ordinary day would turn into an unforgettable nightmare. The clock struck 9 a.m., and daily life continued as usual across the city. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the very heart of Oklahoma, as a large part of the federal building was destroyed, with debris scattering in every direction. The streets were turned into chaos, and black smoke billowed into the sky. Dozens of injured people screamed for help, while bodies were found under the rubble. The eyes of the police and investigators were filled with confusion. How did this happen? Who was behind this catastrophe? Everyone knew that this was no mere accident. As the tension escalated, police and medical teams rushed to the bombing site. Rumors spread, and investigations rapidly gained momentum. The entire city was on high alert, living in a state of uncertainty and fear. Authorities began questioning eyewitnesses, and the initial investigation suggested that the attack was the work of an organized terrorist group. As suspicions grew about whether other threats would be carried out, the government imposed a security lockdown around Oklahoma City. Everyone wondered, were more attacks on the way, or was this just the beginning of an even bigger disaster? As the investigation progressed, detectives started to piece together the missing parts of the puzzle. After hours of searching, it was discovered that the explosion had been caused by a truck filled with explosives, specifically an Oklahoma City type, bomber, rare and unusual type of device. The truck had been parked near the entrance of the federal building, and the massive explosion destroyed the ground and first floors completely. However, that was not the only surprise. There was something bigger behind this attack: encrypted messages, traces of extremist movements, and anti-federal government messages, which opened the possibility that this could have been orchestrated by an anti-government group. The question on everyone's mind: who was behind this horrific bombing? While authorities struggled to decode this violent attack, investigations turned toward known figures in the local community. Several names emerged, but Timothy McVeigh was the one who raised the most suspicion. McVeigh, a veteran of the U.S. Army, had expressed his anti-government views on numerous occasions. Some claimed that he harbored a deep resentment against what he considered the overreach of the federal government, but the truth was still unclear. As investigations intensified, hints began to pile up pointing toward him. The evidence was scarce, but specialized detectives began tracking his every step, uncovering links that were initially invisible. Days after the explosion, investigators began connecting the dots that linked Timothy McVeigh to the attack. He was an eccentric man with extreme views against the government, and he had spent his recent years in isolated areas. Testimonies from his neighbors described strange behavior, and some information suggested he had been in a nearby area to the bombing site. Investigators began to connect McVeigh to a bomb similar to the one used in the explosion, making it impossible to ignore him. Was he the perpetrator, or was it just a coincidence? As the answers grew closer, the mystery surrounding the crime deepened. Everyone in the city began to suspect that justice might be near, but were they right? On April 21st, 1995, the world was stunned when Timothy McVeigh was arrested in a terrifying turn of events. 2 days after the bombing, he was apprehended in a nearby town based on reports of a suspicious vehicle. It seemed McVeigh was driving unaware that he was under surveillance, and he was detained on suspicion of the Oklahoma City bombing. It appeared to be the beginning of the end, but the truth was that this was only the start of consequences larger than anyone had expected. From here, things would take a more dramatic turn. As investigations unfolded, a network of evidence began to show McVeigh's direct involvement in the bombing. Testimonies and personal correspondence indicated an angry war veteran who sought revenge for the events at Waco, but the true nature of his motives was far more complex. In hand, there were irrefutable pieces of evidence, explosive homes, fiery words, all telling the story of a broken man searching for a path to redemption. What initially seemed like an isolated crime began to look like an internal struggle against something larger than just personal revenge. Was McVeigh merely a tool or part of a larger movement? As investigations delved deeper into the bombing conspiracy, Terry Nichols, a close friend of McVeigh, was arrested. In June 1995, he was charged with involvement in the bombing. Nichols had played a pivotal role in preparing the explosives and coordinating the attack. But what was striking was that Nichols seemed to be just a tool in McVeigh's hands, although suspicions lingered about his active participation in the attack. It gradually became clear that the bombing wasn't just an individual act, but the result of collaboration between extremist ideologies. As evidence mounted, investigators began uncovering the motives behind the bombing. Phone calls and personal messages revealed that McVeigh was deeply angry with the federal government, especially after the Waco incident in 1993, where many civilians were killed in a raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. For McVeigh, the bombing was his way of protesting what he saw as the government's overreach. The investigation evolved to reveal a network of extremist groups planning to carry out violence against the government. The bombing was just part of a larger wave of anger against U.S. authorities. Investigators began to realize that this wasn't just an individual act, but a sign of an emerging phenomenon of political violence. In 1997, a new chapter began in the case, Timothy McVeigh's trial. The prime suspect was now in the defendant's seat, facing charges of first-degree murder and involvement in an act of terrorism. His lawyers argued that he was in a disturbed mental state at the time of the attack, but the evidence was clear. The court was charged with tension, and the families of the victims watched every moment. McVeigh refused to admit to committing the crime out of personal vengeance, instead insisting that the bombing was a fight for justice against the wrongs he claimed the government had inflicted. The trial was filled with suspense, and the nerves of everyone involved were stretched tighter with each testimony. During McVeigh's trial, his behavior was extremely odd. Over several months, McVeigh admitted that he carried out the bombing due to his ideological convictions, claiming that he was trying to stop what he saw as the government's tyranny. Although he expressed some regret for the lives lost, there was no real acknowledgement of remorse. Throughout the trial, McVeigh made controversial statements, shocking the public even further. As the trial neared its end, the mystery surrounding his motives began to fade, and everyone awaited the court's verdict. In 1997, the court handed down a death sentence for Timothy McVeigh. The court ruled that the bombing was one of the worst crimes the country had ever seen, and his sentence sent a clear message that such acts would not go unpunished. The moment was critical, as everyone awaited the final decision. Victim families sat in court, wrestling with feelings of anger and pain, but deep inside, they felt justice had been served. A death sentence was handed down, but would it be enough to close the deep wound left by the massacre in the city? While the focus was on Timothy McVeigh's trial, Terry Nichols, McVeigh's partner, was soon to face his own trial. Nichols had been convicted of aiding McVeigh in planning the attack and faced charges of murder. During his trial, evidence showed that he was an integral part of the attack, having helped gather the explosives and coordinate the operations. But during his trial, Nichols tried to defend himself by arguing that McVeigh was the mastermind behind the attack and that he had been merely a tool in his hands. The court sentenced Nichols to life imprisonment, but the sentence didn't bring closure to many. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh's death sentence was carried out at the federal prison in Indiana. The final decision had been made, and it was executed early in the morning. McVeigh, once a war veteran, was now part of the nation's dark history. In his final moments, he requested that his death serve as a warning to anyone contemplating violent acts. As the media across the country witnessed the execution, the victims' families found some solace in knowing that justice had finally been done, though their pain would never be erased. Despite the years that have passed since the Oklahoma City bombing, the effects of the incident remain vivid in the collective memory of the United States. The bombing influenced changes in domestic security laws and led to shifts in counter-terrorism strategies within the country. It also served as a catalyst for improved cooperation between federal and local agencies to combat organized crime and violent extremism. Yet the wound left by this massacre never fully healed, and the city still lives in its shadow. Years later, Oklahoma City continues to remember how the city shifted from calm to chaos, and how it took years of investigation and prosecution to bring peace. Source of the case: the Oklahoma City bombing case, 1995, is one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in U.S. history. It occurred on April 19, 1995, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The case was investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and closed with the conviction of Timothy McVeigh, who was executed on June 11, 2001.